So the last topic we're going to talk about this week is input and output. Typically when you write a computer program, you're going to have sort of 3 steps involved. Generally, your first step is you receive some input from somewhere. So this is information that you either receive from the user via the keyboard, potentially you get it from another file, potentially you get it from mouse clicks. After you receive that input, you perform some process on that input. Now keep in mind this process is usually a good chunk of code. This will usually be the main part of your program. Maybe it's some math calculation that you're doing. Maybe you are changing data in an Excel spreadsheet. There's some sort of process that you do with that input, right? And then the last step is you produce output. So again, output is just something that is displayed on the screen. Output can also be sounds. So output is anything that is sort of an outward manifest of the data that you calculate after this processing stage. So again, typically a computer program gets input, does some process on it, and then produces output. Sometimes it'll do sort of multiple repetitions of this, so maybe you get input in a couple different locations, maybe you display output in a couple different locations, but this is the general flow of a program. So we'll go back to this Hello World example, right? So we've already talked a little bit about output. We've already talked about this print statement. Print is actually a form of output, right? And that makes sense because again, output is just anything that is either displayed on the screen, displayed through sound, anything that is outwardly manifested. So we saw when we ran this code, print hello world, that would display this phrase hello world on the screen for us, right? So print is a form of output, and it's probably the most common form of output in Python. It's pretty easy to use. You just print. Inside the parentheses is whatever you want to display on the screen. So let's talk about input then, right? We've already talked a little bit about output. Let's talk about input. So again, there's lots of different ways you can get input. Today we're going to talk about receiving input from the keyboard, meaning you run some code and then the user, whoever's sitting at the computer watching your code run, can actually type in stuff from their keyboard to provide as input to your program. So just like Python has that built-in ability called print, it also has a built-in ability called input. So input is another one of these Python keywords that we've been talking about. And the way input works is you write out an assignment statement, right? We talked about assignment statements when we talked about variables. So you have some variable name here. Here variable is, some name that makes sense for the program that you're writing and also that abides by the rules and guidelines of naming variables in Python. You have an equal sign because we're doing an assignment statement. And then on the right-hand side of this assignment statement, so again, the right-hand side is the data that we're going to put into this variable. We have a couple things going on. We have the word input. So again, input, this is a built-in Python keyword. So you type in input all lowercase. You have the open close parentheses again, which is similar to how print was, right? And then inside those open close parentheses, you're going to give some prompt. So the idea behind this prompt, it has to be a string. So we've talked about the string type already. One thing that is interesting though, unlike print, right, we talked about print can have multiple different pieces of data inside of the same print statement that's separated by commas. Input can only have one piece of data. So you can't have multiple strings inside an input. You just do input, parentheses, and then one string inside of it. You can't have 2 strings, 3 strings, etc. You can have one really long string, but it can only have one string. So whatever you type in as the string here in your prompt, that is what's going to be displayed on the screen that says, hey, give me some data. So we call it a prompt because it should prompt or ask the user to type something. So a good example of a prompt would be, how old are you? type in your age. Something that says, hey, user, give me some data, essentially. And again, prompt is going to be a string. That is a rule with input. Prompt has to be of type string. And again, this variable, like I said, this is the name of the variable that will store whatever the user types in. So again, this variable is a storage location. So that prompt is displayed. How old are you? Let's say. User types in their age. Whatever age they type in will be stored into this variable. It's pretty cool, actually. Alright, so here's an example. I think this input keyword is best taught by looking at an example. So I'm going to go ahead and encourage you to take some time now to go on your computer, open up idle, find idle in your Python 3.7 folder under either your program files or your applications folder, and go ahead and go into idle, make a new file, and then type this stuff in. So this is an example of a program with input and output. So I'm going to go ahead and follow along with you. So again, go ahead and open up idle. Make sure when you're in idle, you make a new file for this, right? We talked about with the shell, if you type stuff into the shell, you can only do one line at a time and it doesn't really save anything. So it's much better to go ahead and make a new file. And then just for sake of time for the video, I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this. That said, I would encourage you to go ahead and practice actually typing it out, just so you can get sort of used to typing out, you know, all these parentheses, all these quotes. One thing that I do want to point out with this example is this space right here. Now there is a reason why I put that. Let's go ahead and actually get rid of this space to see what happens if we don't have the space. Alright, so go ahead and type this up exactly as it is here, and then you'll have to save it. So go ahead and save it to that folder on your computer where you're storing all the code for this class. I'm going to go ahead and save it as sample input because that's what we're doing, right? We're seeing how input works. Go ahead and save. And then let's go ahead and run it. Alright, so as you can see, when we run this code, this prompt that's inside this input statement comes up on the screen. So it's saying, hey, what's your name? Alright, I will go ahead and type in my name. If you're following along, go ahead and type in your own name instead. Once you type in your name, press enter or return on your keyboard. When you press that enter or return, it will store whatever you type based on this prompt into this variable here, name, and then it'll go down the next line of code that says, hey, go ahead and print hello, which is a string, comma, name, which is a variable, right? So here we see printing a string, and then whatever is stored inside of this variable. Now what's really cool is whatever this variable is whatever you as the user typed in right here in the prompt, right? So if I were to run this again with a different name, let's say Jemima. Jemima is my cat's name. So if I run it with this name, it'll say hello Jemima, which is pretty cool, right? I didn't have to change any of the code, but it automatically adjusted to this new name that I gave it. Now I will say, if you are having issues running this, go ahead and make sure that you have everything matching down to punctuation. Make sure you have these parentheses. Make sure input is spelled correctly. Same thing with print. Make sure both of these are all in lowercase. Make sure everything matches exactly. If you're still running into issues though, feel free to post on the online discussion forum or send me an email. Alright, let's talk about the space though, right? Initially, we had this extra space character here. See this extra space here? So the reason we want to do this is because if you see here in these two previous runs, this prompt came up, and then immediately afterwards I started typing names, right? And it just looks a little weird, right? This name is right up against the end of this prompt. So if you instead add this extra space, so go ahead and do that now, add this extra space, make sure the space is still inside this string though, right? You want it to be part of the string, so the space needs to come before your quotation marks. So add an extra space, and then go ahead and run it again. Yes, you can save it, run it again, and we'll do the same thing. And you see now when I type in my name, it looks a little bit better. It's better formatted, right? You have this space between the prompt and the name that you type. So go ahead and type your name, press enter again, and it should say hello, your name again. So whenever you're working with input, make sure whatever string you put here, first of all, should be some sort of prompting string, meaning it should either be asking the user a question or telling the user to enter something. Make sure it's of type string, right? So make sure you have these quotes. Also make sure for formatting purposes that you include this extra space character at the very end of your string, but inside the quotes, right? To make sure it's part of the string. You also need to store the result of this. The result of this is essentially what the user types in here on that line into a variable. Now in this example I use the variable name because that makes sense for this case, right? Whatever the user types in, that's going to be their name. Now you could change this to be what is your age instead, right? If you do that, you want to update the variable name to also update to age, or something that makes sense for whatever you're asking. And then when you update this variable, you then also have to update it here as well, right? Because the whole point of this line is to display whatever is stored inside this variable. And specifically, whatever is stored there is what the user typed in there. So let's get rid of this hello, because that doesn't really make sense to say hello age, right? Let's go ahead and save it. Let's run your file again. Alright, and then go ahead and type in your age. Let's say you're 3,000 years old. Kudos to you. Alright, so go ahead and type that in, run it, and there you go. You can see here, it took whatever you typed in here after this prompt, stored it into this variable age, and then on this next line of code here, it went ahead and print that age. That's where this extra 3,000 comes up. So again, input is pretty cool. The cool thing again about input is if I were to run it again and I said, okay, now I'm 4,000, it still works, right? It adapts to whatever you type in. That's the whole point of this input statement. It'll work with whatever value you give it. I think it's pretty cool. Alright, that said, at this point, you are all ready to start the lab assignment for this week. The lab assignment for this week will be working with input and output just like this. So feel free to get started on that now. If you have any questions while you're working on it, feel free to email me. If it's a general question, feel free to post on the discussion forum. After you finish the lab assignment, go ahead and start your programming assignment. In fact, I might recommend reading through the programming assignment first, just so you get an idea of, what you are expected to do. And then that way you can think about it a little bit as you're working through the lab assignment. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to post on the discussion forum, send me an email. Otherwise, I'll talk to you all next week.